The history of African Americans in the United States is a story of resilience, struggle, and unfortunately exploitation. While many have heard about the injustices faced by the Black community throughout history, one aspect that deserves closer attention is how Black people were systematically robbed of their lands and wealth. Let's delve into the horrific facts surrounding this issue. African Americans held ownership of at least 14 million acres of land at the turn of the 20th century. By the turn of the 21st century, they had lost possession of 90% of the land. At present, African Americans only hold a total of 1.1 million acres of farmland, with another 1.7 million acres held in shared ownership. Over a century, white farmers and landowners devised a variety of strategies to seize the land of African Americans, including the use of heirs property tax sales and the Torrens Acts. These strategies included taking land by force. Examining the extreme means that were taken by people who stole land from African American homeowners is necessary to comprehend the scope of the thievery that occurred in this instance. Both the laws and the practices made it possible for white landowners, farmers, and developers to exploit the system to obtain control over the property that was owned by African American farmers and homeowners. This was possible because of the segregationist policies that were in place. Different states had different policies on the methods by which people were permitted to steal land, and each state had its strategy to trick Black people out of their land. The inheritance of property, on the other hand, was a strategy that was utilized by all of them. In the vast majority of instances, Black people did not have wills, which is a legal document that may be used to pass land from one person to another after the death of the owner. When there was no will, the land was divided fairly among all of the known descendants of the deceased person. The land would continue to be subdivided among those descendants even after those descendants had passed away. Imagine a staggering 14 million acres owned by African Americans at the start of the 20th century, only to witness a shocking 90% decline by the dawn of the 21st. The means and methods, crafty legislations, targeted strategies, and sheer force. But this is nothing. What's ahead might just surprise you. Stay with us and uncover the intricacies of a massive theft that history often glosses over. Throughout several generations, the number of owners would increase to a significant level. According to Modern Farmer, this presented difficulties for the landowners because it is difficult to use heirs' property as collateral on a mortgage, to subdivide it, to develop it, and to do any number of other things of a legally binding nature without first identifying and tracking down every heir and gaining consent from each of them. It was finally made simple enough for other individuals to come in and take possession of the land, especially considering that every member of the family could not be located to request permission for selling the land. Therefore, even if certain members of the family chose to maintain ownership of the land, other family members could decide to sell it. The land would ultimately be owned by white developers who would take advantage of the miscommunication among the family and seize possession of the property. The second scam that was utilized to cheat Black people out of their land was the sale of their property through taxation. Tax sales were a means by which land might be repossessed from its owners and then sold at public auction. In these situations, people of African descent would like to keep living on their land rather than selling it, but the majority of them lived on a set income. As a direct consequence of this, a significant number of these homeowners ultimately discovered that they were unable to pay their annual property taxes. After they fell into debt, the county would put the property up for auction and try to recover its losses. When real estate developers wanted to get their hands on land that families didn't want to sell, they used this as an advantage to their benefit. The Torrens Acts were a third available option. The Torrens Acts were modeled after the Torrens systems, which were initially implemented in Australia in the year 1858. Sir Robert Torrens devised it with the intention of enhancing the certainty of title to land and simplifying dealings involving land. This was the motivation behind its creation. When it was first passed into law in the United States, the Torrens Act was intended to streamline the process of registering titles. Instead, it turned into a loophole that third parties might use to forcibly evict families from their land through the use of partition sales. A partition sale is when one of a property's owners wants to sell, but the other owners do not want to sell at the same time. The Torrens Act and the restrictions that went along with it made it possible for sales to go place without notifying family members or any of the other people who owned a stake in the land. Once the sale was finalized, the restrictions associated with the Torrens Act protected the buyer from any legal retribution that may be taken by the owners of the property who were not aware of the sale or did not agree to it. The cumulative effect of these tactics, which were utilized over a century to either steal land from people or else deceive them into selling it, was disastrous. Between 1950 and 1964, A total of 800,000 acres of land was taken without permission in the state of Mississippi alone. According to the findings of a research group, the worth of the land that was illegally taken in Mississippi ranged from $3.07 billion to $6.06 billion in current currency. And these figures are just for one state's worth of riches that white people stole from African Americans by stealing their land. Today in the United States, 43.4% of people who identify as black are homeowners, which compares to 72.1% of people who identify as white, 51.1% of persons who identify as Latinx, and 53.4% of people who identify as Asian, Indigenous, or other. Homeownership is the single most important factor in both the accumulation of wealth and the transmission of wealth from one generation to the next. The lessons of history teach us that black people's attempts to become homeowners have been met with resistance at every stage. Although redlining is the aspect of the narrative that is most commonly discussed, the other misleading practices. These practices include the Torrens Act, heirs' property sales, and partition sales. Theft of black-owned land is not a widely discussed topic. However, similar to the practice of redlining, it enables people to see that the reason African Americans are behind financially is not because they don't try. Rather, it is because every time they had a chance to get ahead, laws, rules, and regulations, as well as those in positions of power, used the system to bend the rules to take from them. When it came to the theft of land from African Americans, it wasn't just government institutions that were responsible. Rather, it was white people who had the money and were familiar with the rules that they could use to defraud African American landowners. White people were able to exploit government rules and institutions to not only take land, but also profit themselves once they had obtained ownership of it, thanks to the rules and laws that were in existence at the time. It was simple for the rest of us to turn a blind eye to this vast theft because it was carried out over decades and consisted of thousands of seemingly insignificant transactions. Theft of black-owned land in the modern day is not as common or overt as it formerly was, and new methods of wealth extraction have gained prominence. But what we can learn from the history of the appropriation of black land in the 20th century is that if no one asks questions about what thousands of seemingly insignificant financial transactions add up to in a nation that was founded on slavery, then we are positioning ourselves, whether on purpose or not, to miss the next wealth extraction schemes for decades as well. We cannot afford not to address these issues in a society where the typical white family still has 8 times the wealth of the typical black family and where the racial wealth inequality is getting worse. Theft of black-owned land occurred in the 20th century and continued into the 21st century, and it had significant repercussions for the lives of African American landowners and the people descended from them. When they steal your land, they steal your future, says Stephanie Higgins, whose family had 35 acres of land in Matthews, North Carolina, taken from them in 1942. Higgins' family had lived on the farm since the early 1800s. There is no way for us to know what life would be like now if all of that land hadn't been seized, but the financial destinies of African Americans may have looked very different.